writing is, as you know, an essential skill for every PhD student because it's one of the essential skills of a professional academic. So beyond the PhD, when you're looking at postdocs or more permanent positions, a huge amount will be based on what you've published. So essentially, the basic currency of academia is writing. So it's something that is, super important, as important almost as the research itself. But of course, writing is also one of the biggest sources of stress for PhD students. And part of this is because of the particular circumstances of a PhD. So I was mentioning in the previous session about the differences between undergraduate degrees and PhD. The way that a PhD is assessed is fundamentally different too. So unlike an undergraduate degree where there are exams with a cumulative grade, in a PhD, everything rests on the thesis. So there's a huge amount of pressure on that one document. And as I said earlier, unlike an undergraduate exam where it's graded relative to your classmates, a thesis is judged according to the standards set by the field, often with external examiners coming from other universities to assess whether it's good enough for a PhD. And that will be relative to the work that's already been published related to the problems that you're working on. So there's a huge amount of pressure just in terms of the way that it's set up. Added to that, of course, a thesis is likely to be the longest document you will ever write for the majority of people. You might be writing in a second language, or in some cases even a third or fourth language. You might be writing while still doing research, so you're overloaded by the number of things that you're trying to do at any one time. You might also have so much to say that you don't know where to start. So when we add together all of these things, it's not really surprising that a lot of people find it so stressful. But before we get into what to do about it, I'd just like to ask, how many of you have been given really good training in how to write as an academic? Zero. I think I've given this talk a few times, and I think I've had one person put up their hand, confidently. I don't know what their background was, but... So
what is really good training? I mean, this is the thing that no one will put up his hand, right?
Okay. Trained to a level where you feel confident in your ability. Or define it however you like. Right. So we've got this situation where it's an essential skill, but nobody's really being trained how to do it. And this is common across a huge number of universities. You might have an afternoon workshop or something. I say that when I'm giving an hour and a half talk. But if you want more, you can invite me back. But the amount of training is generally extremely limited. So we have this situation where the skill levels are generally quite low. So you basically go in with whatever skills you developed, in your prior education, but the difficulty and the emotional pressure are extremely high. So it's like a perfect recipe for overwhelming stress. Now, the standard writing advice, which you will see in countless books, blogs, videos on YouTube, which is almost universal, is don't think, just write. Don't worry about detail or structure. Focus on just getting words down on the page to give yourself something to work with that you can edit later. And if you get stuck, write about something else. Now, this has the advantage that if you're really unsure of what to do and you just throw words down, then you might produce something. You can fill pages this way. But longer term, it causes quite a lot of problems. So the first problem, which I think I'm amazed that academics actually say just write without thinking about detail, because detail matters. In so many academic projects, it's a little detail, a little statement, a little assumption, which makes all the difference to everything that follows. So to write without paying attention to any detail, if one of your basic assumptions is wrong and you haven't thought about it and you just write it, then you write 100 more pages, that one detail could mean the rest of it needs to go in the bin, potentially, right? So detail matters. Second problem, if you just write, and every time you hit a problem, you work on something else, it trains the habitual response of avoiding problems, right? So you just need to keep producing, keep getting words down on the page. Don't worry about that problem. But then what about when you run out of easy things to say? Then you're left with all of the difficult stuff, and you haven't developed the skills to solve those problems. You've just trained yourself. Well, I just need to write. So then you've got to solve all of the difficult problems when you've got less time, which again is obviously going to increase the stress. Also, the more you do this, the more you just get words down on the page, obviously the harder it will be to edit. It's harder to edit 100 pages of raw text than it is to edit one or two. So then, as I was talking about in the previous session, you're trying to learn this new skill on a massive scale. So what your ambition is going to be far beyond what your ability is, and again, you're going to be massively stressed, and you're not likely to improve. The other thing is, it completely avoids telling you anything about how to actually write well or edit. So what these people do who say just write is they send you away and you think, oh, I've got through my writer's block. I can just write. I don't have to worry about it. But what they don't have to deal with is the massive mess that people are left with. And I think it is a shocking failure of these people who claim to be writing instructors to say just write. So there is no other field of human activity where a competent teacher will tell you to just do it as fast as you can, to keep going and ignore the details. So imagine if you were a chef, you went to culinary school and they said, just cook, don't taste your food, just don't worry about ingredients or technique, just get food on the plate as fast as you can. It's obviously ridiculous. Or a driving instructor saying, just drive, don't worry about road markings or what's going on around you, just move as fast as you can. Doesn't make sense on any level. So my view is that, sorry, my slides are slightly out of order here. My view is that writing is a skill like any other. It is possible to learn how to write well, paying attention to detail and structure and making deliberate decisions as you go. And it is possible, if you develop these basic skills, to write a good first draft relatively quickly. So I'll just have to skip back a little bit. So the fundamental problem that we want to solve is that the ideas and the knowledge in your head, they're not stored in a logical order. So it's more of a kind of tangled mess of interconnected ideas and insights. So if you just write in the order that you think of things, then the text will reflect that tangled mess. So there'll be no kind of overall structure and the individual ideas won't be properly developed. So what I'd like to present is a way of taking this tangled mess of ideas in your head and putting them into a logical order. And also I'd like to present a way of approaching the writing process that will help you to solve problems as they arise and develop your writing skills. Before we get to those two things, which will be kind of the main sections of this talk, we want to say something quickly about mindset going in. So one of the traps that people often fall into with writing is that they think that they have to show how much they know. So kind of like in an undergraduate exam, what you're tested on is what proportion of the syllabus you can remember, generally speaking. And anything that you miss, you lose marks for. So because you've been through that system throughout your entire education, you carry that implicit assumption into the PhD as well. And so a lot of people will go into writing thinking, I need to show that I've read all of these different papers. I need to show the examiner how much I know. But if you want to show that you're an expert in something, then it's better if we think about it from the point of view of what would someone who's got massive amounts of experience in the field do? So some Nobel Prize winning professor, right? The assumption would be that they know more than they're actually saying. And what they're doing is they're selecting from their knowledge what is the most relevant and most important information. So if we see the PhD writing process as trying to develop those skills of a professional academic researcher, then that's what we want to emulate. We want to select from our knowledge what is the most important and relevant information in order to communicate effectively. The second thing is that a lot of people worry about what the examiner wants to see or what they might want to see. And people often know where the gaps are in their own knowledge. So they start to worry. Well, there's this part that I don't know that much about, so I need to write more to convince the examiner that I do actually know that thing. But again, it's not an undergraduate exam where the examiner goes in with a set syllabus, a list of things that they expect to see. What they will do is they will judge your writing based on what you say your own aims are. So you effectively set your own syllabus, and then you select what information you think is most relevant to serve the needs of your particular project. So the examiner will judge it based on what you say you're going to do. Okay, so it's all about what you want to communicate, and generally speaking, it should be the things that you're strong in, rather than worrying about what the examiner wants to see. So what you defend is the content of your thesis, and what you choose to write about, you're effectively choosing the ground for your own defense or the syllabus for your own examination. So it makes sense to bring the examiner onto territory where you're strong instead of going onto theirs. Okay, so onto structure. So for me, structure is the most important thing in academic writing. It's the thing that I spend the most time working on with students. And it's because the structure is what helps to guide the reader. So we'll spend a bit of time on that. So instead of just writing in the order we think of ideas, we can think in terms of a narrative structure where a piece of research, any particular piece of research, is a response to a problem, a question, or a need. So if you think of any paper that you ever read, there is kind of a central problem or question or need that they are trying to address. And that problem or question or need arises from an initial context. So that could be a situation or a series of events. So we could say, for example, the coronavirus pandemic being a situation that occurred, which created a need for certain types of research, right? And then specific questions, right? So there's a context. That's a context that everybody knows about, but every individual bit of research exists within the context of either a real world situation or kind of a situation within the research field, okay? So this applies to almost any project or any story generally. So to illustrate this point, I'd like to use the plot of the 1994 movie Speed. Basic idea, basic problem. There's a bomb on a bus. If the bus drops below 50 miles an hour, it will detonate. So the overall story is how they respond to the key problem. But within that plot, within that problem, there are a number of smaller problems that they need to solve along the way, okay? So it's kind of a ridiculous example, but the basic idea of narrative applies no matter how complicated your research is. So whether it's something completely trivial and stupid like this film, or whether it's the most serious world-changing research, the same basic idea applies. So I'll keep this slide up for a little while if you want to take notes. And if anyone wants a copy of the slides, then I can send them out. Basic structure. So this works for the introduction of any project. So first you describe a situation. Then you describe a problem or a question that arises from that situation. In most cases, you won't be the first person to address that general problem or question. There might be something specific that hasn't been looked at, which is the particular focus for your project, but often there's a broader question, and then you're addressing, some particular aspect of it. So other people will have responded to that problem or question before, but there will be a need or a gap, which means that you need to approach it in a different way or expand upon what's been done in some respect, and then that sets up what you aim to do. Okay, so we've got these this series of ideas where each one kind of sets up the next. Okay, or each point is kind of a response or a consequence of what has come before. So I'll give an example. So let's say we have a situation where worldwide the number of PhD students is increasing. However, so we introduce a problem. There is also evidence of disproportionate levels of stress among PhD students. And then we have research responses to this, which could be something like, while there have been a limited number of studies to date that have highlighted the scale of the problem, and individual institutions have made efforts to provide better support, there's been little research into the effectiveness of different interventions. Okay, and then this research will. Okay, so you can see how here, where we've got the kind of responses, where we say there has been little research into the effectiveness of different interventions, it's almost obvious what the next point will be, right? So obviously this research will look at the effectiveness of these particular interventions. So it flows and it guides the reader. So pick this example because it's really easy for everybody to understand, but you can apply it to anything, no matter how technical or complicated. Now, the great thing about this kind of structure, so obviously here we've just got bullet points, is you can then expand upon it. You can use that structure as like a framework for all the specific bits of information that you want to provide. So expanding on this, we could say, over the last 10 years, there's been a huge increase in the number of students enrolling in doctoral degree programs worldwide. Then we can back that up by saying recent statistics from the UN estimate that, right? So we're adding supporting detail to that initial point. Then, while the increase in numbers of doctoral students is seen globally, it's even more marked in developing nations such as. So again, we're giving a little bit more detail, a little bit more nuance. We could say why this is happening. This is in part due to concerted efforts at government level to do whatever they're doing. And then we introduce the problem. Although increasing engagement in doctoral research has a number of benefits, recent evidence has shown disproportionate levels of stress among PhD students. So we've taken the same structure and we've just expanded upon it and put in kind of supporting details and little bits of extra nuance. So even though we're adding extra information, we don't need to alter the overall structure. And this makes it much, much, much easier to edit your writing than if you just write with no structure at all. So if you are then reading a paper that talks about all the advantages of for society of having more researchers, for example, then if we look back at this structure, we could say here, although increasing engagement in doctoral research has a number of benefits, we could change that point slightly and say, and then put that paper in to say what those benefits are for society. Okay, so the overall structure doesn't change, and we can figure out where to put things, where to add detail, or extra nuance. Sorry, bear with me 1 second. So to all those people who say just write without thinking about detail or structure, I say, when you can do this, why is that necessary? Why go through that step of writing hundreds and hundreds of pages when you can just write it perfectly well first time? But you just need to know how to do it. So this idea of structure, you can then apply to any paper and also any section of a paper or thesis. So I'll give a kind of general picture. So we basically have cause and effect, or stimulus and response. Okay, so there's a natural kind of chronology to things in terms of A causing B, or however you want to think about it. So in terms of causes, we have situations or events, so an event could be a particular discovery, which then raises a new question, which then triggers a load more research in response. Okay, a situation could be a global pandemic, which causes a need for rapid development of a vaccine, right? When loads of companies responded to that. So we have these causes which lead to problems, questions, or needs. And then on this right-hand side, we have the responses. We will have answers or partial answers, because it's very rare that you solve a problem or answer a question completely. And there may be other consequences. So the other consequences could be new problems, new questions, new needs, right? So this is why kind of I put the problems, question, or needs in the middle, because they could be a cause or they could be an effect, right? So they kind of sit in between. So when you've got all of this tangled mess of information in your head, if you can start to think of it in terms of these aspects, then you can start to figure out how you can structure your writing. And if you have some information that doesn't fit this, usually it's better to leave it out. So if you have some information that doesn't help you to answer a question or serve a need or address a problem, it's probably not that relevant to what you're doing. Okay, so let's give another example. Let's say if you're talking about a particular theory and you want to give a little bit of historical background. So we start with an old situation. So let's say, for example, until the late 1960s, it was widely believed that whatever it is. Then we have an event or a discovery, right? Something happened that disrupted that situation. It was only with the discovery in 1967 of whatever it is by this person that this started to change the way people thought about it, or whatever it is. We have responses or consequences. So this then led to the development of an entirely new theory of whatever it is based on the idea that. Okay, so you see the development. And then, of course, we can have other consequences. So maybe this theory helped to explain something. It served as the basis of some new technology, led to some disagreement or debate within the field, whatever it is, and you can choose how you want to direct that. So it's very flexible in that regard. What about literature reviews? So as I said, any individual paper can be thought of as a response to a particular problem or a question. So let's say the problem is, how do we define or measure X, whatever X is. Now, typically, the story in most cases within the literature is quite similar. So the literature might seem like a big, tangled mess of contradictory stuff, but generally speaking, the narratives you see time and time again. And if you can unpick those, if you can spot those, then it really helps with the writing. So generally what will happen is there was some kind of problem, somebody proposes a solution, and then this has some kind of effect, right? So maybe the idea that this person proposes, it gains some influence, or maybe it sparks a debate, or maybe it's widely adopted. But then, this initial solution that somebody proposed, maybe there's a problem with it or a limitation. So let's say, for example, they developed a technique that works really well, but only for a limited set of circumstances or samples. And so others then respond to that by developing alternatives. So that could be a modification of the technique, or it could be a totally different way of achieving the same thing. Then that often leads to wherever we are at the moment with the cutting edge, where people are working on particular problems with that, with that kind of technique, right? So what this does is it kind of sets up a context for the current literature. Now, again, this is a very flexible structure because you could cover this history very, very, very briefly in 1 or 2 paragraphs, or you could give 10 pages, 20 pages, 100 pages of detail on all of the different developments that have taken place within this story, right? And it's entirely up to you how much detail you want to give, depending on which parts are most important for your own research. Okay, we can play around with this structure. So let's say instead of it being one author proposing a solution, we could approach it a different way and say there are 3 main ways this is approached. Okay, the first and perhaps most widely used was proposed by this person. Okay, so here we're doing a slightly different way. So instead of giving a historical kind of narrative, where it says there are 3 main ways this is approached, what we're doing is describing a situation within the field. Okay, so I'm just trying to kind of show the component parts, the mechanics of this, and why it works. So there are 3 main ways this is approached. The first and most widely used was proposed by this person. Explain it in whatever detail you want to do. And then again, we introduce a problem. So if there are 3 ways people are doing it, there's got to be a reason why not everybody's doing it the first way, right? Some limitation, some kind of problem. So although this approach is effective in this way, it has the disadvantage that whatever disadvantage, and then other people develop responses. Okay. So as I said, this kind of structure applies to any section of a paper or thesis. I could probably talk about this for about 3 hours. Actually, I do. I've got a writing course where I do this in a lot more detail. But this is the basic idea that you need to know. And in the Q&A, again, we can look at individual sections. I can give more examples. Okay, so in terms of the process and how you do this in practice. I need to remember to drink water because I'm going to be talking for a long time today. Okay, so number 1, so going back to what I was talking about this morning, when you've got a big, difficult task, often what you need to do is simplify. So instead of trying to write an entire draft, an entire chapter, doing things on a big scale, it's best to focus on one section at a time and put all your attention on that, and try not to jump around between different sections. So we reduce the scale, reduces the complexity, makes it a little bit more manageable. So if you're at a stage where you're under time pressure and you're, say, writing your final thesis, I would say go one chapter at a time, but more specifically one section at a time, which I'll talk about in a bit more detail in a minute. If you're at an earlier stage and you just want to practice, then what I would suggest is writing short, standalone pieces with a specific focus. So that could be a little section that just explains the theory behind the technique that you're using, for example, right? So that becomes much more achievable, much more manageable than just throwing down everything that you can think of and trying to get all of your knowledge down on the page. The second thing I would suggest is separate the process of exploration from presentation. So one of the justifications for the approach of just getting words down on the page is that it helps you to explore ideas and figure out what you've got to work with. But obviously, as I said, that creates a lot of problems because that work then becomes very, very difficult to edit. Now, if the goal is just to explore an idea or give yourself something to work with, you can do that without formally writing in a linear structure. So as I mentioned before, the ideas in your head, they're not stored in this order that's kind of easy for somebody to read. It's a big tangled mess and your brain will tend to jump between different things. Now that's really good for creativity, but if you write a stream of consciousness, nobody else is gonna understand it. So the way that I approach this is instead of typing into a document, what I'll do is create a mind map where I dump ideas down on paper and I can just kind of figure out what I've got pretty quickly. So what I do is I'll put the title in the middle. So it could be, for example, Managing the Stress of a PhD. And then because the title's in the middle, I'll then write around it. And then I can draw connections between different ideas. I can add notes. So if there are, for example, any gaps, anything that I need to look up, then I can put, next to a particular idea, look up, it could be in my case, look up the blog post where I've written about this before so I don't have to, write it again. Or in the case of if you're writing a literature review, it could be, let's double check the reference where I think this idea came from. So it very quickly shows you what you've got, and it also shows you where the gaps are and identifies things that you might need to do in preparation. So you can do this without initially thinking about structure. You can be very, very free form. This is very, very quick to do. So in 30 minutes or less, you can sometimes get enough for an entire chapter. It's also very quick to review. So if you've got a single A4 piece of paper, you can glance at that and you can see everything. If you follow the approach of just writing, and you've got 50 pages of just stream of consciousness, how do you find stuff? It's really, really difficult. So there's multiple advantages to this mind map method, and the speed of reviewing it, being able to refer back to it is one of the key ones. Okay, so once you have kind of this stock of ideas, then we can start actually putting words on the page. What I always do, and again, this kind of goes against a lot of the common wisdom, is I always start with the introduction. So a lot of people say you should write the introduction last because it's only at the end that you know what you're going to say. But especially if you're in experimental sciences, you've done the experiments, you've got the data, you've done the analysis, so you should know at least what the basic problem is that you're responding to. So it should be entirely possible to write the introduction at the beginning. If you don't, so you don't know what it is that the aim of the paper is or the experiment, there's a problem that isn't solved by writing. You need to figure your experiments out and kind of plan what you're actually doing. So if you start with the introduction, one of the big advantages is it tells you exactly where your focus needs to be. So this is if we think of this as the start, the basic challenge is, well, what do we say first? What do we set up in order to try and lead the reader into the body of the work? Okay. So I've given you kind of a basic structure that you can follow, setting up a situation, leading into a problem that you then respond to. But even with that structure, it can still be a little bit difficult because you've got to figure out what words to use. You've got to solve the problem of expression. But because we've narrowed the focus onto just the introduction and the first paragraph of the introduction, then you're not having to deal with all of the other stuff, right? So because we've narrowed our focus, it becomes a solvable problem. We've reduced that scale. From there, what I always try and do is work in an unbroken sequence from the introduction up to wherever I am. So this is one of the things that I decided to do when I was writing my thesis. So when I was an undergraduate and I was writing, generally speaking, I mean, it was often quite close to the deadline and I was in a bit of a hurry. So I would jump around in the document, right? So if I got stuck, I would write about a different section. But I kind of realized that for something of the scale of a thesis, that would create all of these gaps, right? And it would be much more difficult to link all of that together. And what I decided to do was basically not avoid any problems. So I would, wherever I was up to in the document, that's where my focus was, and I had to try to solve that problem. One of the consequences of that is I never needed to decide what to work on. It was just wherever I was up to. So when you get to this point, you might find that you hit the dreaded writer's block. And this is where a lot of people will say, or just carry on or work on something else. But writer's block, it's not a single condition, right? It's not one thing. It can have multiple different causes. So it might be that you just need to spend some time and find the right words. So it might be, or the way I kind of often experience it is it's like I have the idea, I know what I want to say, but it's like I can't quite grab hold of it. And if I try too hard, it's like it disappears. It's like trying to grab hold of fog. But if I stay with it and I kind of relax, then I can often find the right way to express it. There will be things that are easier to express than others, especially things that you've spoken about thousands of times, or ideas that you know really well or that you're confident in. They tend to be easier. Then there'll be other things where you've maybe never explained it before. It's something where you're not quite as strong in that area, and it just takes a little bit more time. So you have to give yourself that time to try and solve that problem. So sometimes it really is just a matter of staying with it, relaxing, trying to find the right words. However, sometimes when you're at this point, you realize that this next thing that you're trying to explain, maybe it needs to come earlier in the document. This certainly happens to me all the time. The deeper I go, the more fundamental I get. And then I realized actually I needed to say that right at the beginning. So for me, even though I never kind of jumped forwards to write about another section, what I would do is go back, and if this idea needs to go here, I'll go back and put it in there. Okay. So the way I think of it is like, or the metaphor I use, is it's almost like digging a tunnel through a mountain. So wherever the end of the tunnel is, you can't jump deeper into the mountain. You can't jump forwards. You've got to work on the kind of rock face, as it were. But then if you realize you need to go back and reinforce some of the tunnel, right, put in some wooden struts or something, then that's okay to do, right? So it's okay to go back and reinforce some of what you've already done, but you can't jump forwards. But you've got to find a way to solve this problem at the rock face, whatever it is. So sometimes you realize this idea needs to come somewhere earlier in the document. Sometimes you might realize, actually, if I just cut that idea, then that solves my problem. And then what I can do is I go back to my mind map, back to my stock of ideas, find something else that fits better. And then very often, then the writing will start to flow again. Other times, this idea, it just needs to come later. So I'll just put it to one side and make a note, put that in, chapter 3 or wherever it happens to be. So you've got a number of different options for what you do at this point. Okay. So as I was saying earlier, the more difficult the task, the more attention it requires. And if you're trying to solve a writing problem where you don't know exactly what the solution is, right? It requires your complete attention, and it requires the patience and persistence to kind of stay with the problem. And again, you might need sometimes to step back, relax, think, and re-engage. In my case, often I'll be sitting at the computer and I'll just stare out of the window. And it's kind of like just letting the thoughts go by, and then I eventually find a solution. But other times I might need to just get away, go for a bit of a walk, reset, and then come back to it. But this brings us back to what I gave as the absolute #1 most important tip in the last section. When you step back from the work, so when you take a break or when you get tired, don't go online, don't pick up your phone. Because then again, you remove the opportunity to solve that problem. If you step away from the work, if you get away from the computer, then if you're walking around the campus or something, then your subconscious can keep working on the problem. And you often find that when you come back, you've got a greater sense of clarity. If you interrupt that process with email, news headlines, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, whatever it happens to be, then you're completely removing that opportunity. So many people treat email and going online as a break, but it's not a break mentally because you're flooding yourself with information, and it's not a break physically because you're still staring at a screen. From a different perspective, if you think about your visual field, right? If you're writing, you're staring at a screen, you've got this very, very narrow kind of window of focus. Then you're looking at your phone, and it's even narrower. There's a great neuroscience podcast by a guy called Andrew Huberman who talks about focus and stress, and he talks about the importance of broadening your visual field when you've been focusing on something for a very long time, and it has a lot of kind of important neurological effects. So this is something which is really, I think, really important, is breaking that habit of just checking email or staring at a screen all the time. You need time where you're using your peripheral vision, both physically and metaphorically, because when you broaden your vision a little bit, you'll then sometimes see the connections between ideas that help you solve some of these problems. Now, when I talk about this way of working where you stay engaged with the problem and you try and solve it as you go, and you're basically trying to write the best first draft that you can, a lot of people raise the issue of perfectionism. I think perfectionism is not quite the right word. I think there's nothing wrong with trying to do something to the best of your ability. And certainly in your experimental work, a bit of perfectionism is important, right? If you miss a particular step, if you don't do something right, you don't get the results that you want. There will be times when you need to be absolutely perfectionist. Where things get confused is when it's not necessarily perfectionism in the sense of trying to do the best job you can and having kind of a clear process or a clear goal in mind, but rather having more of a sort of excessive hesitation or self-doubt where you write a sentence and nothing you write is ever good enough, and so you delete it, and then you write something and you delete it, and you write something and you delete it. And this is kind of based on either self-judgment or a fear of somebody else's judgment. It's not really perfectionism. It's a different thing. It's indecision. At the other end of the scale, though, we have total carelessness. So this is what I was talking about, where you just write as fast as you can, where you defer all thinking for later, you abandon problems as soon as they arise, and you give no attention to detail. So people often justify that approach as a counter to what they call perfectionism, what I call indecision. But there's a lot of space in between those two extremes, right? So if you obsess over every single word that you put and everything has to be perfect, that's obviously not healthy. But then paying no attention is not healthy either. So we have this range where you can give care and attention to the work that you're doing, but without being overly worried about the end result. So without being driven by fear of making mistakes, by fear of how people will judge you. And you can adjust where you sit on this scale. So there may be times when you have to go a little bit faster, just because of circumstances. So you might have a submission deadline, right? So maybe you're a little bit less careful, right? Your priority is just getting things done as quickly as you can. There will be other times or other parts of your writing where you have to be absolutely perfectionist. So I mentioned at the start that the examiners will judge your work based on what you say your aims are. And so where you have a statement that says the aim of this thesis or this paper is, right, that's what they're going to judge everything else based on. So you need to phrase that really carefully. So it's worth spending a little bit of time on it. And a number of times I've read people's work where there are maybe 3 or 4 places where they state the aims of the thesis, and they're all different, and none of them are what they've said they're going to do when we're in conversation. So, you know, that means, well, how on earth can I judge any of the rest of it, because I don't know what you're trying to do. So there will be times when you need to be, you know, a bit more perfectionist, but you can adjust where you are. So if you find, for example, you're sitting at the computer, you've been sat there for 45 minutes, you haven't written a single word, maybe leaning a little bit more towards, you know, the prioritizing speed, and say, right, in the next half an hour, I'm going to try and write 100 words, for example, right? And then once you've got a bit of momentum, then you can maybe, you know, go back and be, when you've got a bit of momentum, you can maybe ease off in terms of the pace a little bit. And then at some point later, you can go back and be a bit more perfectionist, correct what you've written, etc. Right? So we can adjust where we are. It's a little bit more of a nuanced approach. Okay. So as I said, some things will be easier to write about than others. Your pace will naturally vary as you engage with and solve problems. So don't put pressure on yourself to maintain the same pace all the time. You want to let yourself slow down, relax, and solve problems as you go. But when you take some time and face a problem, then you find a solution, it feels good, right? It feels good to have engaged with those things, and rather than just leaving them for later. And ultimately, this is how you improve your writing skills and you develop confidence. So, 47 minutes, not bad. Pretty much bang on schedule. So again, we'll get into the Q&A. I've covered a lot of things, again, fairly briefly, and some things I've not talked about at all. So again, you can choose whatever you want to talk about. If you want more examples of different sections and how to apply this idea of structure, then I'm happy to do so. But it could also be anything kind of surrounding writing that might get in the way as well.
Writing and time management. So what is your advice on that? Like setting aside, for example, 2 hours in the morning every day, or have like big blocks of this week I'm just going to write.
Yeah.
And how to get yourself into that focused mode where you can actually write, because this often takes quite some time, and to me feels like an inefficient process.
Okay. So I think in terms of the question of scheduling writing, whether it should be 2 hours a day, I think that depends on what stage of your PhD you are at. Some people say that you should write every single day. I don't necessarily agree with that, because it depends on why you're writing, right? What is the purpose of it? The most important thing is your research. So that should be the priority for the bulk of your PhD. And there will be periods where you're not writing at all, and you're just focused 100% on the research and the analysis, etc. Okay. However, if you are not very confident in your writing and you want to set aside some time for developing that skill, that's not a bad idea, especially if you're writing in a second language, and you kind of know that might be a weakness. Then it's really important to practice. The number of people who have to write a thesis in English know that it's a weakness, right? So they can converse, but they find it really difficult to write. And then it gets to the point where they have to write up and they've not done anything about it. So they've had years, literally, to where this problem has been in the back of their mind, and they've not practiced the written language skills. So of course it's going to be stressful. So if that's the case, then yes, setting aside some time to practice writing and maybe get some language guidance is a really, really good idea. How you do that, whether it's say 2 hours on a Tuesday and a Friday, I mean that's entirely up to you. But if it's that kind of longer term practice, then doing it regularly is a good idea. And there will be times when that's difficult to do because there are things that seem more urgent. So, whatever, for whatever reason. But the thing is that these longer term skill development things, they might not be urgent in the short term. So nothing bad happens if you don't do it this week. But if you consistently don't do it, then you get to a point where, you've got to write your thesis in 6 months and it's sort of like, it's too late. So I kind of think of it, again, metaphorically, it's the difference between, I think you used the phrase firefighting, putting out fires during the coffee break. It's the difference between putting out fires or planting seeds. So planting seeds takes a long time to see the results of your labor. But it's really important if you want to have your crops to eat or to sell by next year or whenever it is. So it's really important to put aside that time. The other part of your question in terms of getting into that writing focus, it does take a little bit of time. Often the problem I find is my thoughts are kind of going too fast, right? So I see too many, there's too many different things all at once. And so for the first, 40 minutes or so, I might not get very much done. But the way I see it is I've kind of got to relax into it in order to find that flow and not worry too much, not put too much pressure on myself. So if I'm, for example, just starting a new piece of writing, with the introduction, there might be different angles that I could take on it. And so I'll kind of mentally be exploring, maybe I could do it this way, maybe I could do it that way, even with these kind of principles of structure. And then I just sit with it until I kind of make a decision. So I don't put myself under too much pressure to be productive straight away, but I'm still working because I'm still kind of figuring out. It's kind of an experimental or exploratory initial phase. In order to do that, I need to be disconnected from the internet. So it's always the first thing I do is turn off, basically block the browsers with cold turkey, put my phone, on silent, on do not disturb. Because if I get a WhatsApp message while I'm in that phase, I'm done. It's really, really, really difficult to get their attention back. So even though I'm a pretty confident writer, I believe in my ability. If I get distracted during that time, it's really, really, really hard. So turning off the internet, having some uninterrupted time and space is super important, and then being patient with yourself in that. And then, as I said, if you find that period goes on for too long, then doing a little bit of faster writing and saying, well, I'll just write 100 words, relatively quickly. So it's not going all in on that just right approach, and doing that to such an extreme that you do that for an entire draft of a thesis. Do it for 20 minutes, then slow down and pick apart what you've got, and then you can kind of construct from there. Yeah, that was a long answer. Yeah.
I have a question concerning knowledge gaps. So, for example, I've been writing on a section, and then I realized, okay, originally my thought was I would just fit my data and everything's fine and continue from there. But then I realized after reading, okay, fitting might not be as straightforward as I thought beforehand. So now I would have to do some comparison, compare some fitting procedures, for example, and then decide on what to do to continue. So now I'm like, okay, I could either do that now, so refrain from writing and do the fitting and the comparison, which will take me some time, but I also already have some ideas about what to continue with, and so I'm unsure how to handle it.
Okay. Generally speaking, I think if you again, it kind of depends on the purpose of the writing. So if you're just kind of trying to practice writing in the background, then you could be doing the analysis and the data fitting on the one hand, and then maybe with the writing, you could be writing a section of literature review, for example, or writing about your methods or whatever it is. So I think you should write about stuff. If you're doing analysis, so you don't know what the results or the conclusions would be, if you're writing at the same time, then it should be things that are not going to change in response to this work that you're doing. Okay. Generally speaking, for a lot of people, what I'll say is, put the writing completely to one side and just focus on the research, because that's what you're going to present in the writing. So that's kind of the priority. So yeah, if you take the pressure off in terms of writing a little bit, get your analysis done, present it to people and get feedback so you identify any problems with it. It just saves a lot of time rather than writing about it and then having to change it all. Okay. Yeah.
One of the first barriers I encounter is the language issues, because I don't know, I think in another language and then I try to write this idea, and I don't know what it's better if I write my ideas in my language and then try to translate, because if I try sometimes to do it immediately in English, then it's like complicated and I get stuck easier.
Yeah.
I don't know which.
Okay. There are two things I would suggest. So one is to, again, kind of reduce the scale of what you're trying to do, right? Because if we talk about the English language, it's massive, right? It's far too much, and it's kind of overwhelming. But what you can do is write short pieces, which you see as not necessarily for official examination, but just for practice, right? So it's, just take the pressure off, right? But then if there's something, so let's say, for example, again, something that's not going to change in response to your research, but like the methods or the theory behind the methods, those are things that you can figure out how to explain. Okay. You can then reduce the scale even further and focus on if there are if you find there are particular problems you have with the language. So like in your native language, if there's a particular kind of structure where you feel like, this is really frustrating, I don't know how to use this kind of grammatical structure in English, or maybe it doesn't even exist, figuring out a solution to that and really studying kind of that grammatical aspect. That's where a language tutor can really help you. And the good thing is there's a huge number of English teachers, and they can, which means they're relatively cheap, and they can help you So getting that professional help rather than putting pressure on yourself to figure it all out. Because there's limits to what you can do yourself. And there are people who can, in 5 minutes, teach you what might take you a week to figure out. So I think that would be important. So reduce the scale, focus on particular things, and get some help, and do that as early as possible. So you're not trying to do all that in the last month of your PhD. Also, of course, get a proofreader at the end. Again, there's a lot of them. So, you know, they kind of drive each other's prices down, which is not good for them, but good for you. Okay. I think I'm seeing a few like tentative hands. If you can put your hand like straight up so I can see, you know, whoever wants to go next. Yep.
So I wanted to ask, when you're writing, so sometimes it happens for me that I write it and actually it should be more than it should be. So how to expand it, so like, you know, and also how to write it interesting. So sometimes when I write it, it's super simple. So when I'm reading the other papers, it's very, you know, fancy words, very interesting. So
Okay.
how to work on it, how to improve it.
Okay. So there's a few different questions within your question. So in terms of expanding on something, it depends why you're trying to do that. So sometimes genuinely there's missing information that the reader needs to know in order to understand your project. But then sometimes people kind of feel like, well, I've only written a paragraph on that, so, you know, is it enough, right? And sometimes it is. And often the best writing, I think, is quite concise. So if your short bit of writing genuinely really well, perfectly explains, I won't say perfectly, but clearly explains with no ambiguity what you're trying to do or what the idea is, you know, it's fine. If you do need more detail, then this understanding of structure is really important, because then you can figure out where that detail needs to go. You need to be quite selective about the detail and the references that you add. One of the things that I see quite often is basically just like a list of stuff that people have said, right? So it'll be a particular, you know, there'll hopefully be a particular theme or idea, and then it's just Smith says this, or, you know, Smith conducted this study with this many people and blah, 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 blah. And there's a paragraph on what they did. Then next paragraph, Jones did, you know, something else, and there's like nothing to link it together. So you, if you're adding a lot more detail, it's thinking about often what's your starting point or the reason to be interested. So you talked about interest in terms of, you know, you said like kind of using fancy words. I think more so than the language, if you set up an interesting problem or question. Okay, so what's the fundamental reason why this information is important? Start with that and make sure that's clear. And then if you can put in a narrative, simple one would be, let's think of a simple example. So let's say there are two main schools of thought on this issue, right? So we've got a problem, whatever it is. Then we set up a situation. There are two main schools of thought. On the one hand, you know, according to Smith, you know, there's, you know, it should be this. However, as Jones argues, this doesn't take account of these particular factors, right? So we've got a bit of a narrative in terms of the disagreement between these two people, and then you can kind of, you know, construct something around it. So it should never be a case of just adding information because you think it's too short. There's got to be a reason for the reader to be interested. From the examiner's point of view, this is not universal, right? Because some people will say that a longer thesis is a better thesis. That's so, from my perspective, that's so not true. what I think, and from some of the examiners I've spoken to, they would only want a thesis to be longer if it's really good, right? So you never want to be adding stuff just for the sake of making it longer, because then the examiner, who's a busy academic, has to then, you're then forcing them to read it. It's much better if you're kind of concise in what you say and just give the information that they need to know, or that you personally find interesting. That's usually a pretty good way of approaching it.
Yeah. So what do you think of the idea of having a collection of notes, so either like the Zephyr custom-based Obsidian or OneNote or whatever, and then basically writing everything down, and then when it comes to writing up, you're just copy-pasting the relevant bits and editing it down.
Okay. Okay, a couple of thoughts on that. So one, whatever system of note-taking you use, you want to make sure that it's all in one place and it's easy to navigate. If you end up with loads and loads of different subfolders where you can't find stuff, that's pretty difficult. So sometimes people can be a little bit too clever with their note-taking systems, and then they can never find stuff again. If you use so sometimes these tools can help, and the advantage is that they're often searchable. But if things are buried in different folders, sometimes you can't find it. If I think back to my own PhD, basically all the notes were written by hand. So I had a lab notebook, date at the top of the page, and then this is just what I've done for the day. When that filled, just started another one. The disadvantage of that, of course, is that it's not digitally searchable, but everything's kind of sequential. So I'd know roughly when I was working on something, or I could identify that pretty quickly, and then I could find all the notes on it. If I think sometimes for digital notes, if you just have one long text file with the date, then it's really, really, really simple, really easily searchable. So it keeps it as simple as possible. That's kind of my thoughts on that. As for pasting stuff together, again, I've seen people saying, for example, with a literature review. So for everything you read, write a little summary of it. And then you can kind of paste those things together and you've got a literature review. I saw one blog post years ago, and it said the title was "How to Get a Literature Review to Write Itself." The problem with that is that then each individual paper, as you're taking notes, you don't necessarily see how it links to other things. And so if you then take those things and just paste them in order, then it's just Smith did this, Jones did this, somebody else did this, somebody else did this. And the stuff that you take notes on, how do you know exactly what's relevant? So you maybe read a paper in your first year from a particular perspective, but then in your third or fourth year, you should have more knowledge, so you would pick out something else, or maybe you're writing about it for a different reason, so you pick out a different detail. So I think, although it sounds like that should save you a lot of time, it doesn't necessarily. So what I would do, sticking with that literature example, is basically have a system where you can find relevant papers again quickly, and then pick out what the relevant details are based on whatever it is you're writing about at the present moment. It's pretty rare that you'll have like the perfect notes that you can just copy and paste in. You've got to think about the context. So a section on methods would focus on a different part of a paper, right? Actually, I'll talk, backtrack a little bit. A section about methods, following the idea of structure that I was talking about before. All of the methods, all of the decisions you make are responses to needs. So you need a way of measuring something, you need a way of analyzing something, you need a way of preparing a sample, whatever it is. Okay. Then you might bring in the literature and say, well, basically in response to this need, this is the technique that this person developed. So, so then, you're looking at that literature in a particular context in your writing. If you've got the perfect notes for that, copy and paste them in. Otherwise, usually it's going to be a case of rewriting, I think. Okay, we've got about 20 minutes left, so it's time for one or two more questions.
So about presenting your own results, so do you have any specific?
Sorry, I can't see who's talking because of the mask. Okay, I thought it was you, I wasn't sure.
So about presenting your own results, so do you have any specific advice to how to convince people that you did really good job?
Okay, so the first thing I'd suggest is don't make the formal writing the first time you get the feedback, right? So you want to be showing your results to other people and see what questions they ask, as the work progresses, right? So it should have, ideally, not everyone gets a lot of support, but ideally, there should have been through one round of feedback where you've tried to convince people. So then you know what questions people ask, and you can address some of those in the writing, right? You can anticipate some criticisms. In terms of presenting the results, I think often, especially in experimental science, it's not just about the result you present, but the methods, the specificity of the methods. So, and that's where detail is super important, right? So if somebody's looking at the results, they're not just looking at the graph or the analysis, they're looking about, well, okay, wait a minute. How did you do your sample prep to make sure that there wasn't contamination that causes this effect or whatever it is, right? So you've got to show that you've thought of all the things that could go wrong. I mean, not all, but you've given it a lot of thought to things that could go wrong that could skew your results in some way. And very often that is kind of how you convince people of the validity of your results. It's all about the methods going in, and then obviously the same applies with the steps of the analysis. What checks have you done with the data to make sure that it's valid. I think one other thing is I'll give two other things. One, it goes back to that point about taking time and care over those details. And then I've forgotten the second thing. When you hit a problem, step back, you solve the problem. So the second thing I'd say is about honesty in the results. So sometimes there's kind of, people want to put the best possible spin on their results. So if there are doubts, if there are open questions, if there are things where, maybe this is not actually the perfect result, acknowledge it in the paper. So again, you kind of create this trust between the reader. It's I've thought of this. I acknowledge that maybe this could be something else. So it's not kind of overselling what you've done. Okay. Yep.
Maybe as a follow-up, you had multiple times said that you would not you want to get feedback before writing it down properly. So on what basis do you get feedback? Do you have some informal writing? I'm from mathematical physics, so
yeah. So
to order my thoughts, I think I have to write it too formally down. And then
okay, yeah, sure. And in that case, in that particular case, if it's a mathematical proof, you've got to you have to write it down in some form. It wouldn't necessarily need to have all this kind of text around it. to kind of set up the context and the literature review and what other people have done. You just present the proof. Hopefully your supervisor knows what you're working on anyway, or you know who to approach. So they should already know that context. And also, I'm guessing that within the proof there will be different parts of that, where you can check before it's complete. Do you think I'm on the right track? Have I done this bit of it correctly? So of course there are variations depending on the type of research that you're doing. So I would give a different answer if you were doing kind of literary analysis, with an English literature degree. With experimental work, maybe it's in the form of just showing a graph, whatever it is. So show it however you can and get feedback and discuss with other people. One other quick point, nobody asked, but I'm going to tell you anyway. This idea of getting feedback, I think it's not just about sort of presenting your work and then asking people what they think of it. I think that it's really, really important to also be interested in other people's work and what they're doing, because that way, well, first of all, it's just nice socially to be able to do that. But you learn about things that are not directly related to your research or not perhaps of immediate benefit. So it broadens your knowledge and your experience, which I think is an important thing. And then you might find that later down the road, some of that becomes useful, and you know who to talk to in order to get help with that particular part. And that could be during your PhD, or it could be 10 years later if you stay in academia. So that broadening of your knowledge, and just being interested in what other people do, I think is really important too. Okay, got time for maybe one more question. Is that yeah?
Yeah, I would like to hear something you note down there about working with your supervisor. So, for example, there might be different ideas or expectations that your supervisor might have that you don't necessarily want to fulfill, or you can't, because you realize that doing your research, that's not something that is feasible to do.
Yeah.
But they cannot realize that because they're not really working on that kind of problem. How do you deal with that?
Yeah.
Especially when writing a paper together.
Yeah. Okay. Anything regarding supervisors is always a little bit difficult to give kind of a perfect answer, because it depends on their personality and the relationship between the two of you. Ideally, if there's that kind of situation where something is unfeasible, you should be able to explain that to them, discuss it with them, and they'll say, oh, okay, right. Ideally, right? You might need to kind of state your case, or you might need to try it to kind of show that it's unfeasible. Certainly this happened a couple of times it happened in a few ways in my own PhD. One way it happened was often when I would have meetings with my supervisor, because he's so smart, he would kind of bombard me with 10 different ideas of things that I could try, just because he'd get so excited and then reel off all of these ideas, and I kind of leave the meeting, what the hell just happened? And it took me a while to realize these were just ideas, and it was up to me to decide what to do with them and where I wanted to lead the research. The other way it happened was one particular point where he suggested an experiment, and basically it would have taken, calculating like the scan rates and things, it would have taken about a week to run this particular scan, which, using the kind of instruments we were doing, that wasn't really practical, because the instruments weren't that stable to be able to leave it for that long. So just again, that was a matter of just saying, that's not really that would take far too long, and he was fine with that. that was his particular personality, though, that made that really, really easy. Sometimes there will be things that your supervisor really insists on. Yeah, sometimes you just have to do it or try it. But yeah, it does depend on that relationship. Sometimes, yeah, with timelines and so your submission deadline or things like that, or needing to if you need to get a couple of publications under your belt before you finish, sometimes you just got to remind them, like, look, I really need to get this done by next September. I don't think I can take on that side project as well. And you've got to tell them, because they don't always think, they don't always remember those things, and sometimes they forget how long things take practically as well, especially if they're far removed from the lab. Okay, any more? Last chance. Yeah.
A bit more general, things like Gantt charts, yes or no?
If they work for you, great. I mean, I'd say this about all of these kind of time management tools. If you can consistently use them and they're genuinely useful to you, keep using them. Often, with the nature of research, it's very difficult to predict how long things will take. And sometimes the trap that I've seen people fall into is kind of trying to control the timeline too much. So when things get a little bit stressful, they think, right, I need to step back and take control of this situation. I need to make a Gantt chart or a timetable, and they'll get the colored pens out, or they'll create this beautiful plan, really intricately detailed, and it gives them a sense of control, right? It kind of relieves that stress initially. But then if there's not enough flexibility in the plan, or if the goals are overly ambitious, sometimes they can find themselves behind the plan before the next day has even started. So, for example, they'll say, right, I'm going to get up at 5:30 tomorrow morning. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do yoga, and I'm going to do this, and I'll have this done before 9 a.m. And then they wake up at 9:30, and then they're already behind. So that beautiful plan, instead of then helping, becomes a burden. It becomes one of those things, a bit like when I said I set the goal of writing the world's best literature review. Failing to do that, it kind of sits in the back of your mind and then feeds into the imposter syndrome and everything else. So I think any kind of plan that you make, yes, there will often be fixed deadlines. So my deadline for submission, my thesis, that was kind of set in stone without going through kind of a formal process for getting an extension and all the paperwork involved in that. I had a particular date, and if I missed it, that was it. I'd failed. Like there's no way around it. For other things, especially when it involves research, sometimes things just take as long as they take, and you need to give yourself that time without having the pressure of saying, right, I need to have this done by Monday. Sometimes maybe taking a little bit longer, doing things a little bit more slowly, with a bit more care, means that you're more likely to get the results that you want, or to figure out with a bit more confidence this way of doing it doesn't work. Right? So acknowledging when things are uncertain and giving yourself a little bit more flexibility. For any kind of plan, because things are so unpredictable in terms of how long things take, I think any kind of plan, really, it just has to tell you, what are you going to do now? Anything beyond that depends on how this goes, but you need to be able to set your priority. So maybe you have a deadline for submitting a conference proposal like next week. So right now, what do you do? Do you do your lab work first and do the proposal in the afternoon? Okay, you make that decision, and then you do it, taking that deadline into account. To further in the future you go, it's a bit like predicting the weather or like any kind of chaotic system. The more the uncertainties kind of multiply. So bear that in mind. Like today, what do you do right now? Further in the future, you've got certain fixed deadlines. The rest is kind of flexible, and you need to be able to make decisions as you go. Okay. We've got time for one more, and then we can break for lunch.
I have a question about the reference management. Is there a strategy for that? And is it better to have the text and then search for references, or to have certain references and then make your text around those?
Okay, so in terms of reference management systems, there are loads of them. So it's like Mendeley, EndNotes, all of these different things. I don't have any particular preference for one or the other. What I would suggest is try out a few different ones on a small scale, find what works well for you, and then stick with that system. So if you try, let's say, for example, Mendeley, if you're writing your thesis in Microsoft Word, can you insert references reliably in the format that you want, right? Does it work smoothly? Okay. If you then find that it's really buggy, it doesn't work well for you, you don't like the interface, you try a different one. So it's good to play with these things on a small scale when you're not under a massive amount of time pressure. Then you can figure out what to use, and then as you're reading papers, you can kind of populate your database. You can do that as you go, or you can occasionally, when you start to write, maybe you can add in the references that you need. In terms of searching for papers, so the second part of the question was about whether you search for the papers first and then write the text, or write the text and then search for the papers. I think kind of a combination of the two. So you shouldn't be writing without having already read a good amount of literature about that topic, right? You need to have a bit of a basis of knowledge of the literature. And there will be certain, this is kind of a big topic. I can feel myself sort of diving into it. So there will be certain papers that are more important than others, right? Both for the kind of historical development of your field and for your own particular research. So there will be some papers that everybody references. So everyone working on this problem, they reference these people. You need to know those, okay? And then there will be some papers that are absolutely crucial for your research. So either they are kind of your direct competition, so they're working on similar things, or they're working on similar things maybe with different methods, or they will be papers that your work builds upon. Right, so you use this specific method for doing this particular thing. Those papers also you need to know really well. Then there'll be loads of other papers which kind of add a bit of context, so maybe they're sort of related, but perhaps not crucial for your work. And sometimes you'll realize, as you're writing, I need to use some of these contextual papers as well to add a bit of detail. So I think, to make my answer short, some papers you will know really, really, really well, you're definitely going to reference them. Other things will be, you're going to write about something where you're a little bit less strong, so you look up a few papers beforehand to build your knowledge on that. Other times you'll be in the writing and you'll realize, there's a gap here. I need to go and look up some of those papers. So it's really a combination of the two approaches, going back and forth with the literature, but starting with a solid foundation of those core papers. Okay. But it's a big topic, and I can talk about it more after lunch. Okay. So yeah, thank you very much for listening and so many great questions. And yeah, I guess it's over to lunch.